My name's Annie Clements. I'm Chief Exec of an organisation called Autism and ADHD, which does exactly like Ron Seal and does what it says on the tin. So we work with people with autism and ADHD. We're a lifespan service that doesn't stop and start at any particular age at all. We're based in Suffolk, but we actually work globally via the wonderful technology of Skype and email. We support people... That's right, it's fine. So we support people, America, Australia, Japan, everywhere, even though we do face-to-face work in Suffolk primarily. I was asked to come and talk today about approaches to talking about abuse with children with autism. You read that and it actually can be taken two ways. So it could be about talking to children who may have been abused, or you may suspect may have been abused, or may have made a disclosure that you're concerned about. But it could also be about talking to children to keep them safe, so that they would recognise themselves that they may be being abused. So we're going to try and do a little bit of both. Just to put into context about me personally, just the same as an awful lot of the speakers that have been here today, I'm a parent. I have 3 children who all have a diagnosis of one thing or another, my middle son being the most severe. So equally, I can fall into that lovely category of the percentage that may or may not have an autistic spectrum disorder. What I can say with great confidence is I was involved in a research project some time ago with Cambridge Research Centre, where they were taking the fingerprints of mums to see if there was anything really interesting about them. And apparently, mums of children with autism have male-orientated fingerprint patterns. So if anyone wants to see a male-orientated fingerprint, I have one. I actually don't know what the difference is, but I'm sure there's obviously something. Otherwise, it wouldn't have come up as an issue. Now, as an organisation, we like to focus on getting people to understand what autism and ADHD is. And by that, I mean really understand. And we do lots and lots of really cool stuff to do that, involving the young people that we work with and the adults that we work with coming to talk sometimes, but also in them designing the presentations that we give. And it would have been lovely to have brought someone up today, but unfortunately the person who was due to come up with me today was unable to be here. So you're left with me doing this little experiment that we're now about to do. So, to do the experiment that we want, we need to involve you. And I really would love to have a volunteer from the audience. You have to come up the front. Hi. Your name?
Andy.
Hi, this is Andy. Now, Andy's been very nice to be at the front, and all Andy has gained by coming at the front is a prize. All right? So I've given Aaron a little worry person. All right? Thank you for coming up. I'll explain why you came in a moment. You can go and sit back down. So, you all had the opportunity to come up, and you would have won a prize, and you didn't come. So why didn't you come up? Who was feeling... oh, God, she's going to get me to go up there and I don't know what I've got to do and she might get me to do stuff and I'm going to look really stupid. Yeah? I'm not that mean, actually, but it could have happened. Or, oh, I'm right at the back and if I come up the front, I'm going to trip over and make myself look a bit of an idiot and in the end, I'm not going to know what she's going to want me to do. Yeah? So your anxiety played a huge part in you not coming up. People in the front row weren't going to give me any eye contact at this point. I'm just going to keep my head down. And then she won't notice that I'm at the front here. And she's not going to ask me, so I'll get away with it and it'll be fine. What done that? What made you feel anxious about coming up? The power of them... Sorry? Yes. Because maybe you have come up and been made to look a bit of a fool in the past. Your mind is a really powerful thing at that point. The fear that it puts into you in that space is massive. and you start to feel really, really, really unsafe. Really emotionally unsafe enough to walk up to the front. So what can make you feel safe enough to leave your chair and come up the front? You know what's going to happen. So let's have a look at this bit here. And this is about talking to anybody. But when you start to bring autism into the agenda, if we don't understand what they're getting anxious about and the way that they want to communicate with us, then we're pretty stuffed. And yet, time and time again, when we're going to start to talk to a child who may or may not have a diagnosis, we forget that. We think that they're just going to be able to come into a room and sit on a chair and suddenly talk to a complete stranger about something. We do that to adults as well. Huge expectation, even for us as parents, if we're going to go for a diagnosis or we've got to go and see a professional. Oh, you just need to come to this place at this time. No information about what's going to happen in that space, where we might need to be able to park. So many different things that potentially are going to add to our anxiety before we've even walked in the door. Now, these three faces we use a lot in the work that we do. And if it's the only thing you actually remember from this session, it will be a really good thing for you to have remembered. The space above the line represents our really, really, really cool brains here. And the space below represents our emotions and the way that we're dealing with a sensory situation. Everybody in the world does this. You do this. Your partners does this. Your children do this. And I want you to try and focus into where that sits for you, because it will then help you understand how it may feel for somebody with autism. Help you put yourself in their shoes before they're coming into a situation. So, circle number 1 is when we're having a good day. We haven't got up and found that the washing machine's flooded the kitchen floor, and we haven't lost the car keys, and we've remembered our packed lunch, and oh God, no, I haven't remembered to lock the back door, so I'm going to have to go back and do that. None of that's happened. The day's going well. And so emotionally, we're quite balanced and calm. Do we all know what that feels like? Some of the time. Yeah? We're not in somewhere that's really noisy or smelly or hot or uncomfortable. We're not wearing clothes that don't fit us properly and feel really weird. Our shoes don't hurt. So from a sensory perspective, we're also fine. And when we like that, our heads have got all of that space to do some really pretty cool stuff. So we can plan and we can think and we can listen, we can absorb information, we can deal with the odd problem. We can also make better choices about how we're going to deal with something. Not always the best one, but we can make better ones. When that emotional stuff gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, what happens to that space? What's happened to the space in the picture? Less space. So think of it as a jug being filled up with water, and it's filling and it's filling and it's filling and it's filling, and the space at the top gets smaller and smaller. And so we could be getting really, really angry about something, really anxious, really upset, really overwhelmed with noise. There's a lovely noise in here. which if you didn't hear it now, you're going to hear it. Right? Okay. That space that we have left at that point to do that really, really cool stuff has then gone. That's when we shout at people, have an argument with somebody, and then think the next day when we've calmed down, oh, God, I really shouldn't have said that. When we don't make a good choice about keeping ourselves safe. We can't plan properly, we can't process, we sure as hell can't find the car keys. Right? The longer we're looking for car keys, how more irrational do we get about where we start to look for them? Right? How many of you play your music really, really loud in the car, or unless that's just me, all right, when I know where I'm going, and then when I come off and I need to concentrate to find out where to go, I have to turn the music down. So that's what that's like. And it can either go from phase 1 to phase 2 like that, or it can build and build and build and build over a period of time. What do you think the bottom one is?
Trying to keep your head above water.
Yeah, and you're holding it together. How many of us will go into work whilst there's something perhaps really not very nice going on at home, or we've had a really bad drive-in, and we'll go in. How are you today? I'm fine. Right? Now, other people who've spoken today have talked about how people on the spectrum can spend all day pretending to be something that is, you know, some person that is able to manage that space. So many of the young people that we work with, we work in an awful lot of colleges in Suffolk, and it will be, I have to pretend to be this person to go into college, otherwise I can't go. It's not me, but it's the only way I can get through the day. Right? They're holding it together. It's a bit like a bottle of Coke that's been shaken up with a lid on. What happens to that Coke in the end? All goes. So, as we've already heard today, you'll find an awful lot of children will be doing that all day at school. And it's home that cops that. Or it's on the school bus that the lid comes off the Coke bottle. A couple of my mums who always say, I know we've had a really bad day when the school bag gets thrown in the door before they arrive through it. So where it's being hurled from one end of the hall to the other, and we know that they've had a bad day. Now, we all do that. All of us do that, and you'll all be able to relate to that. And I want you to remember that. And I want you to remember that sense of anxiety about not walking up the front. And how scary that can feel. Because it's really, really key when it comes to understanding where people with autism are coming, especially around when the abuse agenda kicks in. They can't self-regulate that. They can't necessarily bring themselves back to phase number 1 without your support, and without the environment being changed, and without the lights being turned down, perhaps, or that horrible noise going away. What are the chances of them being able to absorb information from you or answer questions from you that may be quite difficult if they're in phase number 2? Do you think you've got a hope of getting good, solid information out that you might need? Absolutely not. And equally, phase number 3 can be just as difficult. They might be pretending to be somebody else to get through the day. And actually, they might just be sitting there thinking, got to hold it together, 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 got to hold it together. Are they listening to what you're saying at that point? No. All right? So holding on to that and holding on about what it feels like to be frightened about something because you've not been given enough information about the experience is really, really important when it comes to communicating about anything. But when it comes to communicating about this, it takes it to a whole new level. All right? We all know what it feels like to feel physically and emotionally safe. And it's a good place to be. How do we do that? We choose the people around us. Do we always get that right? No. What else do we do?
We alter our environment to make us comfortable.
Yes, we do. We can self-regulate in that space to make that feel okay. What else do we do? Trust. Trust that that other person has given you the right information. Trust that they're not going to hurt you. What else do we do around trust? There's a really cool skill that we do. Think of the triad of impairment that we've been talking about today. We use our imagination an enormous amount to make ourselves feel safe. How many of you this morning would have visualised your route here in your head? You'd have imagined your journey. You'd have imagined what you needed to wear today. You'd have imagined what you needed to bring with you. You'd have imagined how much time you needed to leave to get here. Imagined what the hotel might be like. And some of that is from previous experience, yeah? So you've been able to use previous experience to help you visualise what today's experience was going to be like. And whilst some of that still might have made you feel a little bit nervous, it would have absolutely have helped you feel safe enough to be able to come today. Now put yourself in the shoes of somebody who finds visualisation extremely difficult. Extremely difficult to imagine that procedure. Extremely difficult to imagine what the hotel's going to be like, what the journey's going to be like, what they need to bring today. And then you start to get a sense of where that anxiety starts to come from. It isn't all of it, but it will help you start to realise where that is. And that's the bit that's really, really key. And you need to take that with you all the time when you're working in this particular situation. What does that stress and anxiety look like? How can you spot that? How can you spot that someone who you want to speak to, who may or may not even be on the spectrum, just anybody, what's it going to look like?
Agitated.
Quite agitated?
Might avoid the situation.
Yeah, trying to get out of the place. What else?
Judged.
Yeah.
Avoid eye contact.
Yeah. What about some non-verbal communication other than eye contact? What else might they be doing?
Rigid posture.
Rigid posture.
Refusing to get out of bed so that they push going later and later and later, so they have to go in such an absolute panic that they don't have time to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to leave it 2 seconds before I need to walk through the door. All right. There can be lots of physical things as well, trying to block it out. How many of you suck your pens and pencils? And when I was a kid, I used to suck my hair, which is about as disgusting as it gets. But how many of you fiddle and doodle and do all of those things when perhaps you might be a bit anxious or a bit stressed? It's what we call socially acceptable stimming behaviour. So stimming behaviour is another thing around the autism agenda that people misinterpret. Hitting heads, spinning, fiddling, needing to get out of the way. It's all coming from the same place. All right, and those are the sorts of things that you need to think about as the spots that you're looking for. So, now let's have a think about someone who is going to come and talk to you. They might have asked to talk to you, or you might actually have asked to talk to them because you've got some concerns. Do you think they're feeling quite safe at that point? Or do you think they might be feeling quite anxious?
Depends on your relationship.
How many times they've been to see you before, perhaps? What do you think might make them feel unsafe? You don't tell them what it's about. What else is going to make them feel unsafe?
If you're late.
Yes. Be late at your peril.
Without saying that you're going to be late. Sometimes you might be late because there's something that happens you're not in control of, like if you're driving an M45 and there's a car crash.
Yep.
Well, you can't really control that. If you bring ahead, then that's probably much better than just being late.
Just be late with no explanation. Think about the sensory stuff. What else might make them feel unsafe? Unfamiliar environment. Or perhaps you've not given the information about what the environment's going to be.
What do you smell like? Like your perfume or your deodorant or your body lotion. Not necessarily that you smell or that you're clean, but if you're hypersensitive to smell, then you might be more likely to pick up on people's natural sense, people's hearing aids and not sterile.
No, absolutely. And also the smell of the environment too. How many of you walk into great big multi-stores into the perfume wall when you're walking through the door, right? And an awful lot of the stuff that makes them feel physically, emotionally unsafe is lack of information that we haven't given them, right? So think about it. You may be going into a situation where you need to have a really, really important conversation. And if you haven't given that person enough information about what that experience is going to be like, there's a really good chance that they're either going to be at phase number 2 or phase number 3 before you've even got them through the door. So think about your pre-stuff. Think about the information that they need to help give you a chance of them being beautifully in the middle here before you even start. And you need to think about where you are too. Because if you're starting to feel nervous about that discussion, or you're running late, or you've forgotten something, or you haven't prepped, then there's a really good chance that you potentially are going to be at phase 2 or 3 before as well. Plan the session. And part of planning the session is to understand the person that you're going to see. So if you're going to speak to somebody who is autistic, right, work out what the triggers are. Ask them. Or ask people that know them really, really well. Are they really sensitive to noise? Are they really sensitive to smell? Are they going to get upset if you're late? Do they need a route? And once you've looked then at the environment that you were hoping to have the conversation in, is there stuff we can make go away? Is there stuff that they need to learn how to manage because we can't make it go away? And give them a backup plan. You need a backup plan too, actually. All right? So, there's a lovely term for doing one of these. Social scripts are really good in this situation. We do a thing called photo streaming as well, where we photograph the place. So photograph the entrance, photograph the way that they've got to come into a space, and photograph the space. And also photograph the people that they're likely to come and see. And it will all help reduce the anxiety about that situation. And the backup plan, something that's going to make them feel safe, that it's all too much, that actually I can have 5 minutes break here. Or so-and-so will be with me, who's going to help me through this situation. This stuff these first few slides are not specifically relevant to talking to children about abuse. They're actually relevant to every single situation that you're likely to engage in when you're working with somebody who may have an autistic spectrum disorder or may have a high level of anxiety. But they're just as important, and I think it's something that we don't necessarily understand. And if we don't get this bit right, we're not going to get the rest right. Okay? Something else to remember, and it has been brought up today. Just because someone's got a high academic IQ, it doesn't mean that they've got mild autism. Someone who's in mainstream school with a high academic IQ may still be struggling enormously with all the things that we've been talking about today, and still will find it extremely difficult to come and talk to you about anything. Extremely difficult to walk down the corridor to meet you. Extremely difficult to share information that maybe they don't even understand themselves. And we forget that at our peril, really. So, what do we need to understand? We absolutely need to do our homework. If you are in a situation where you're going into a really formal interview around interviewing a child who may have been abused, think about the space. Think about the situation that you're taking them into. Are there things that need to be moved around in the room? Or do we actually even need to change the venue? Because the venue that maybe we normally work in still wouldn't be right for this particular child, and we haven't got a good chance of getting it right. If you've got a child who's obsessed with cameras, which is a big possibility, then maybe we need to think about that. And you absolutely would need to share with the child herself that those cameras were going to be there. Because if not, they're going to find that a massive change, because most rooms don't have cameras sitting in the middle of them. Right? We've talked a lot about special interests today. Lego is a big thing. Minecraft's a big thing at the moment, as most of you probably know. I think poor old Thomas is on his way out. But it could just as easily be bags of stones and all sorts of stuff, very sensory things that they like to be able to play with. You need to create a lovely, safe atmosphere, and you need to create something that they're going to start to communicate with you in a really, really safe way. Bringing something in to build a rapport that they like to play with and to sit on the floor or the table or in the pop-up tent that you have there. Pop-up tents are brilliant, by the way. If you have the opportunity to go and get one, then go and get one if you haven't got one already. Okay? They're lovely and contained, and you can put lots of really lovely warm blankets and cushions and things in there, and they're a good place to block the world out, to overcompensate for the sensory stuff that perhaps is going on. Spend time. Play. Chat. Just chat about anything. But it has to be something that's interesting to them. You need to bring it down to here. They need to feel safe with you. They need to trust you. They need to know that you've got their best interests at heart. So use the things that they like to do. And it might take 2 or 3 sessions with them doing that before you even get to the point of talking about the serious piece of stuff that you need to talk to them about. It's not to be rushed. or you won't get the information that you need in the way that you need it. Some of the children may not have any language skills or actually can become quite non-verbal in those situations. And it may be that you as the person haven't got the best skills to be able to interview that child at that point. So use someone who has. All right? It's always necessary to seek special advice on what approach is appropriate. And that's another thing, that bottom paragraph, that is really, really important. They may have really, really, really good verbal skills and can communicate very well. But their social and emotional development may be quite a long way behind that. So don't be fooled into that space, thinking that, oh, they can speak really well, so we'll be fine here. They'll get this. They'll understand what it is that we're trying to say. Some of them will, but not all of them. And you forget that at your peril. And the other thing to remember is the experience itself, thinking back to the 3 faces, if that experience has taken them up to here, or they're holding it together down here, then actually it doesn't matter how well they communicate verbally in other situations, they might not communicate with you that well on that particular occasion. They might get overwhelmed emotionally with the types of things that you're going to speak to them about. Become very distressed and upset, or equally extremely withdrawn, and you need to be prepared for that. And that's where specialist advice and possible intermediaries at that point become really, really important. Drawings and photographs might be needed. Again, they will be different for each child that you see, as we've heard a lot today. Every single person with autism is different. Yay!
Can I just ask, you have to be incredibly sensitive in that situation that you don't start leading to.
Absolutely. I'm not saying any of this is easy.
Investigation.
Yes, you can.
It won't stand up.
No.
Particularly if it's sexual abuse or physical abuse.
Absolutely. It's not about leading them to say things, but it is about giving them the best opportunity that they can to actually be able to share that information, because that's how they communicate. That isn't leading them. That's about creating an environment that is appropriate for them to be able to share that with you. And I absolutely agree with you. There's a real tightrope there. And that's why I think the intermediaries and the specialist provisions at that point are really, really important. This is probably one of the most complex things to actually deal with, if I'm honest. So, Triangle and NSPCC have got an excellent book here. All right. It's free. And the images that are in there can be really, really useful at this point. I think the sad thing about it is that we tend to not introduce the types of language that, when we're in this situation, suddenly become vital into normal day-to-day conversation. We do that with children across the board, but with children with any sort of learning disability or autism, it can be really, really complicated, and parents tend to shy away from it, I think, because they're not quite sure how to do it. And we certainly shy away from it in schools because we're worried about getting it wrong and saying the wrong thing. And so it can be really, really helpful to just use this book prior to anything even being a concern. I think it's something that should be introduced into our education system pretty much from day one. But unfortunately, we don't tend to do that. But it would make life an enormous amount easier if we did. because then some of the terminology and language that we need is already there, or an understanding of the drawings and the pictures. Please go there and download that. It's quite a thick piece of document. They can send you the publication as well if you don't want to use all your print and ink and what have you to print it out, but it's definitely worth getting hold of, and it's very, very helpful. The language that we use can be really, really important. We were recently involved in a case where a young man of 16 had been accused of rape. He was on the spectrum. And so whilst it's the reverse end of this, in that he was the abuser as opposed to someone who was being abused, I think it's a relevant thing to think about. So during the questioning process, he was actually asked if he'd had sex with this young lady, to which he answered yes, he had. And what it actually turned out to be was that he'd kissed her, but that's what he thought sex was. So we need to be really sure about what the language that we use is, and equally what their level of understanding of the language that we use is as well. Because actually, it turned out that he hadn't had any physical sex with her at all. And it wasn't an issue whatsoever. That was very much a case of the young lady perhaps being confused or making accusations that weren't true. The prep's important. Sometimes we can think that we're using the right language and the right approach because we maybe have not done enough prep and we've not spoken to the right people beforehand, and therefore it all becomes overwhelming and confusing, when actually, if we've done that prep, then it makes it a lot easier to plan and give a clear process for that questioning, and it will stop you getting overwhelmed and anxious as well. This is another thing that can cause huge problems. A lot of the children that we work with can receive intimate care. And it can be really difficult to distinguish between this and possible abuse. It's really important that we understand the process of the care and what's involved in that process of that person's care before we have a chance of being able to understand whether or not any abuse has actually taken place. Some of them may also be quite severely physically disabled and are also using equipment that may also cause them pain sometimes, but under no circumstances should lose injury. I think that word pain is very interesting there. It's a terminology that is used quite a lot in a lot of the paperwork that you read, that it might cause them pain. I don't think any equipment that should cause them pain should be used personally. I think it should be more perhaps the word discomfort, but that's where it gets very confusing and very difficult. And the sensory issues may lead to a misunderstanding about level of touch, and they can be very confused themselves. And it comes to the point of where we need to think about whether or not they would even know that they'd been abused anyway. And it will be something that you've observed. What do you think would be your key indicators at that point that there may have been something that's happened that they're not aware that it's abuse, but you can see that something is not okay?
Well, it will still have had an effect on that person emotionally. They just can't explain to you. So it might be a change in their behaviour or their responses to things, but that change might be location specific. So it might be that there's a change at home. It doesn't mean abuse necessarily occurred at home. That could be that they feel safe there, and so they're comfortable to let go
Exactly, which is what we were talking about this morning, and it's also about the shaken up bottle of Coke and phase number 3, okay, where that explosion of behaviour may take place in that safe place. It may be you as the professional that witnesses that, and it's about doing your homework to work out where that's come. You just need to go and look at that, and it will give you some really, really good indications around work with young people with learning difficulties. The behaviour is a form of communication, and it's telling you something, and we need to work out what it is. What's the behaviour trying to tell us at that point that we need to listen to? So many times, and in fact it's been said several occasions today, that behaviour can get misinterpreted. They're just doing that for attention. They're doing that for attention, absolutely. And they're doing it for attention because they don't know how else to tell you that something is not okay. Making them feel safe, planning that session, giving them enough information before they've even got to you about what's going to happen, about what the environment's going to be like, gives you a better chance of getting them to a point where they may be able to share that. And using the right form of communication that they're used to, using an intermediary to help you with that, can end up being really, really important in being able to get hold of the right information that you need to be able to keep that young person safe. Let's think about the fact that we also need to think how we are delivering sexual health education in schools and using appropriate language around young people with autism being able to keep themselves safe. There are some really great resources about now to be able to do that. There's some really good stuff that actually, as the ladies show you at the back from NAS today, about being able to work with children around talking to them about keeping themselves safe, not just physically but online. Information about sexuality, information about sexual behaviour. If they're not able to understand what is normal sexual behaviour and normal relationships and things that are okay, of which they should be able to experience anyway, you're not going to be able to help them understand when it isn't. Another thing to think about as well is what happens when it does actually occur and what the fallout can be, because it isn't always what you think it's going to be. So we worked with a young lady, for example, who, in fact, we'd known her for a long time. We'd known her since she was a very young child. And she's particular obsession was balloons. And she absolutely loved them. She liked to hold them, she loved pictures of them, she could talk about them, she had balloons all in her bedroom of varying different colours and sizes, and balloons with pictures on and everything. And she came to the age of 16 when she was leaving school, and over that summer, before she came into college, she'd been researching balloons on the internet and had come across a group of people called Looners who use balloons for sexual gratification. Mum was completely unaware at that point that that's what had happened. And she connected with that community online and was being groomed beautifully over the camera to stand in her underwear and blow up balloons for the person at the other end of the camera. And Mum wasn't aware that it was going on until there was balloons arriving through the post. So she'd shared her address, she'd shared her name, and she'd shared how old she was. And she was all ready to go. She was all ready to disappear up to Manchester to go and meet him one weekend. She had a diagnosis. Everything that you would expect to happen at that point actually happened. Police were involved, social care involved, all of the right procedures were followed, and the person concerned was dealt with appropriately. But we had a young person at this end who absolutely didn't think that she'd done anything wrong, which of course she hadn't. But she also didn't think that the person at the end of the camera had done anything wrong either. He was her friend. The first friend she'd actually had for a long time. Someone who listened to her. Someone who was allowing her to do things that she was starting to find really interesting and exciting. She liked the whole sexual process with balloons because she loved balloons. The fallout for her about losing a friend was huge. And she ended up being in hospital for nearly 2 years after that. And so this stuff isn't easy. This stuff can be very complicated and very heartbreaking. And the more we can understand about where that anxiety comes from, where that difference in how they perceive relationships, where they're going to get confused about what they see as abuse. What we see as abuse and what we recognise as abuse, there's a really good chance that they won't have spotted that. And so there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done after that too, in a very autism-friendly way. Because the repercussions of removing somebody who they've actually perhaps found a friend for the first time ever can be massive. Okay, I'm conscious of the time. We've got a little bit of time for questions. Is there anything that anybody would really like to ask?
Do you think there's an issue with people like that where they'll say, well, but I've got the capacity to make those decisions and you might not like that decision, but that's what I want to do?
Yeah, that was exactly what happened in that case, all right? If she'd have been a lot older and perhaps an adult, then it may have ended up being a very different conversation. And I think that's really, really important to remember that. It was her age that caused the issue. And, I mean, I could tell you lots of stories around adults and sexualised behaviour and what actually happens there, as I'm sure many of you can as well. But it was the fact that she was only 16 that caused the issue there. And she really, really didn't want it to stop. And in fact, now she's 23 now, and she doesn't live in Suffolk at all, so we've got no actual contact with her, but we do know that she's now re-engaged back into that community as an adult, and there's been very strong safety boundaries put around that to keep her safe, but there's no reason why she shouldn't be doing that as an adult. I think we have to be really careful about where that sits. Okay, anyone?
Just really interesting this morning, the woman that spoke about the difference between identification of women's and men's autism. Mm-hmm. And I think it'd be really interesting to ask you if you know or have picked up differences in how boys and girls with autism might communicate with you about their experiences. Do you notice differences, or is that a bit difficult to try and pick to pieces?
I think it's actually that. Do you mean around this particular agenda particularly? There is a difference, of course there's a difference, because I think a lot of the girls, certainly those that perhaps are more able to absorb what's going on around them, will pick some level of skill up by that. They're much more able to observe other people's behaviour and learn what to say. Now that actually can mean that they hide things much more. They can come across as being far more able than maybe they are, and something that needs to be revisited over a period of time, but their ability to misinterpret things is still significant. I can think of a girl that there's an example in a book around talking about sex, for example, of a girl that went into a secondary school classroom and just lifted her jumper up and exposed her breast, for example. And it turned out that what it was that the boys were bullying the girls that wore bras, and she just wanted to show everybody that she wasn't wearing one. But there was a massive issue off the back of that. And whenever we tell that story to an awful lot of teachers, an awful lot of them will go, well, we'd have excluded her on the spot. And you're like, she was telling you something here, and you need to find out what it is that's going on. And so boys are less likely to perhaps be quite so overt with that. You get an awful lot of masturbatory behaviour around boys, far more so than you would necessarily with girls in the same way. But the communication is still the same. And I think the boys can become quite physically able to communicate that to you, and you've got to be better at picking that up from the physical signs of things and perhaps the aggression and walking out of rooms and getting very, very upset because their overwhelm is going to a different place. Girls can be quite withdrawn and maybe express that differently in that way. So it's about spotting the signs in the same way that boys and girls across the board tend to be different. It's no different in this particular situation. Okay, thank you very much for your time. If you want the handout of the 3 faces, all right, we do that as a free download, and it's not so that you will come and sign up, but it genuinely is, we get so many people ask for it that we've just done it as a free download off the website. So if you just sign up for the newsletter and you'll get sent one through to your inbox, and then you can have it. That doesn't mean you have to keep having the newsletter, as much as I would love you to do that, but it's a way of you being able to get hold of it, and it gives you lots of information on the back.